Good afternoon and welcome to Yellowstone. This is Ranger Jake. Today we're talking about the past, present, and future of elk management in Yellowstone National Park as part of our 150th virtual video series. And to set the scene a little bit, we're here in the northern part of the park, which is where a lot of the wildlife watching occurs, especially a lot of elk and bison. And today we're going to be joined we are joined by Dan Stahler. He's a wildlife biologist here at the Yellowstone Center for Resources. I'm going to let him do a little bit more of an introduction about what he does because he studies more than just elk. But it's been a very cool spring. You can see things are starting to green up. We have Mount Everett's over our shoulder. This morning there was a little bit of snow, but it's starting to melt off. So hopefully more warmer days that are coming along. But I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and jump behind the camera and let you take it away. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Jake. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. You can see here we're just in a beautiful landscape. And today I'm going to talk about the elk. It's really an icon of the West, an icon of Yellowstone National Park. So I want to give you a little bit about their biology first, then talk about the history of elk in the Yellowstone National Park and surrounding areas. Well, first of all, just to remind everyone, Yellowstone National Park protects one of the most abundant and diverse wildlife communities and one of the largest temperate ecosystems in the world. And much of the fate of wildlife, of course, has been controlled by humans through time. But if we just look at the story of the elk, it really is this wonderful tale of an animal that could have been lost, yet Yellowstone served to really protect it at the core of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And Yellowstone's elk really mean much more, not only for the park, but beyond the borders of this national park. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the history. But let's start with a little bit of their biology first. This is a really poignant time of the year for elk. Right now, we're getting towards the end of May, and this is the beginning of an elk's journey as an organism in Yellowstone National Park. What we find with Yellowstone elk is calves are being born somewhere between mid-May and mid-June, with the 1st of June kind of being a peak calving season. And so let's talk a little bit about the trajectory of an elk from the moment it's born. So right now, cow elk are out there getting away from the herd of other cows and trying to select a very safe and secure spot to give birth to a newborn elk calf. And for the first several weeks of that elk calf's lives, very much its survival is dependent on getting enough milk from its mother, that really important nutrient supply, but also evading the risks of living in a landscape with predators, the effects of weather. You know, even though it's May, we're still, as Jake said, get a little bit of winter kind of lingering on. And so an elk calf's first couple weeks really depend on security and food, safety, and so they're hiding out. And those mothers are coming and nursing them. Those calves are hiding on their own. They're spotted. They're relatively scent-free, and these are all things to help protect them, evade predation, and be safe. Those mothers will come, call to them. They have a mother-calf bond, and they nurse, and then those calves then go and hide again while mother goes off and grazes on these nutrient-rich green grasses that are coming up here in the May landscape. After several weeks, those elk calves are up on their feet and can run and move quite adeptly with their mother, and eventually those mothers will gather up groups of calves. We call these nursery groups, and that provides a little bit of safety in number. You get more adult cow elk to be vigilant, to look for predators. I'll talk a little bit about what predators are particularly important. And then as the summer goes on, those calves are growing quite rapidly, and by the fall, those herds congregate up. Of course, then we get into the breeding season for elk, where the bull elk then come down and try to secure breeding opportunities by gathering up a harem of cow elk. Those males fight with one another to compete to be the one to be the most successful at breeding, and those mature bull elk are the ones that are dominating the breeding. The young bull elk are sort of lingering off to the sidelines. The young of the year are still hanging out with their mothers, and then as the fall event happens of snow coming, October, November snows, then those elk go into their migratory practices where they'll come out of the high elevation of Yellowstone and the surrounding areas where they've been feeding all fall and late summer on still nutrient green grasses. And then those elk migrate down for the winter time on what we call the winter range, the lower elevations. Here in northern Yellowstone, the northern range of the park that you're seeing behind us is key wintering range for elk and the other ungulates. And then ungulates, just to remind everyone, are hoofed animals. So bison, deer, pronghorn, elk, they all belong to the ungulate family. Of course, elk are one of 5 deer species here in Yellowstone National Park. and they're one of the largest ones, and they're all share similar sort of nutrition and diet. They're feeding on grasses, sedges, and forbs as part of their food throughout the year, and they have a 4-chambered stomach where they try to extract and chew their cud and extract as much nutrient from those grasses and forbs and all the other vegetation that they feed on. In the late winter, they'll sometimes feed on woody browse like aspen and cottonwood, and that's all part of their diet. The elk are really adept and successful at tracking those food resources in space and time. And so once they're on the winter range, of course, they like to find places where there's relatively low snow. That helps them forage more efficiently, and it helps protect them from the severities of winter that the interior high elevation of Yellowstone presents to them. So that's why they migrate. And so if we think about a cow elk and versus a bull elk, they have slightly different life histories. Cow elk tend to live longer. Usually a cow elk will start reproducing by her 2nd year, and she'll be reproducing every year until she reaches her mid to late teens, and that's what we call reproductive senescence, where they no longer are producing a calf every year. It's just the demands of raising offspring can be difficult as elk get older in their life. And so those prime age cows are really important to a herd's recruitment. They're producing calves every year. Some of those calves will escape the gauntlet of predators and other challenges, others won't. But if enough calves make it through and survive to that reproductive age, they can experience a really successful life for those prime years between the ages of 2 and about 13 or 14. They're relatively resilient to predation during those years. They're very difficult to kill, and so that we find in Yellowstone that you have high survival, high pregnancy rates for those prime age cows. Bull elk, on the other hand, tend to not live as long. It's a very difficult life that they face. They invest a lot of energy in the fall dedicated to the rut or the breeding season. They're bugling, they're fighting, they're chasing around cows, they're evading other bulls, and they tend to go into the winter in poorer shape because of that. So they can be more vulnerable to predation later in winter. And we find in general bull elk do not live quite as long as a result, averaging 10 to 12 years of age. We've had some cow elk here in Yellowstone live to be over 25 years of age, and we know that from some of our research on them, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So that life history, that annual cycle of tracking resources from summer range to winter range is really key to their success. When we look at Yellowstone National Park as a whole, we have about 6 or 7 populations of elk, or herds that we call them, that use Yellowstone. One of the most famous long-term studied elk herds in the world is the Northern Range elk herd. Today that elk herd probably numbers somewhere around 8,000 animals, and it has been historically as high as over 25,000 animals. And those population trends have been dictated by human policies such as hunting, population control in the early years, and of course in the last several decades predators play a much more important story in that population regulation of elk. There are other herds that also use Yellowstone, and what happens is elk are migrating into the park this time of the year right now from herds out by Cody, Wyoming, the Wiggins Fork herd, the Jackson herd. You've got elk from the Madison Valley to the west of the park, the Paradise Valley herd to the north of the park, all coming into Yellowstone because it offers such really wonderful summer range habitat for them, nutrient-rich grasslands all the way up into the high elevations of the mountains, and that really is a key to their success. So that kind of is a brief summary of elk biology. Now, part of what we do as biologists to learn about this is we can study them with the advancements in GPS collar technology. So here, for example, is a GPS collar that we would put on a cow elk. Each winter, we capture elk here in northern Yellowstone, and anywhere between a dozen and 20 elk each winter in recent years will put on a GPS collar. This collar gets a point once an hour around the clock, and these last for about 4 to 5 years. And this provides a really wonderful opportunity to study not only how elk survive when they die, what is the cause of death? Was it a wolf? Was it a cougar? Was it a human hunter just outside the park? Did it die because of winter severity? These are all the pieces of information that we as biologists can gather by putting these GPS collars out.
What are the parts that are on that?
Yeah, so this
collar
is the
right there?
battery, and this hangs below the elk's neck. And this is a power source, 4D batteries that allows it to power the collar. This compartment of the collar at the top is the GPS transmitter, which communicates with the satellites to get a location fix, and then that sends it to a different computer server that we can access the data from. We put numbers on the sides of the collar in case we want to identify unique individuals from a distance. For example, up and coming the next couple weeks, we're going to be following around some of our cow elk to determine if they've had a calf or not. And we can use these IDs to recognize an individual off in the distance. And so that's what the numbers are for. And when we capture elk, we collect blood from them for genetics and disease. We can measure for pregnancy at the time of capture. All of this fits together in our understanding of elk here in our long-term studies on elk population. From this, for example, we've learned, as I mentioned earlier, that prime age cows have very high survival. About 90% of cows are living from 1 year to the next between the ages of 2 and about 13. After that, survival goes down. For example, the average age of a wolf-killed cow elk is about 14. Prime age cows are, again, not selected by wolves. They're too difficult to kill for them in most situations. But of course, a cow elk's calf, this time of the year, the newborn elk calf, is very much the focus of predators. So right now, there's grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, coyotes, cougars, even golden eagles, which will take advantage of newborn elk calves out there. And that's part of the strategy of a calf hiding out, being spotted, blending in with its surroundings, hiding until mother calls to it to nurse it. And so those first couple weeks are really key. Really, the first month of an elk calf's life is full of challenges. And if they can make it through that predator gauntlet, they have a higher chance of surviving until adult age. Yes, Jim?
What's the amount of elk that you're trying to have collared? Is there like a specific target number that gives you the amount of information that you like?
Great question. Right now we have probably roughly 50 to 55 GPS collared cow elk in the northern herd. And that's out of about a herd size of approximately 8,000 elk, give or take. Counting is imprecise, but that's a kind of a ballpark. And that gives us a really good, if we can maintain 50 or more collars on our population, that gives us a good idea to track what we call vital rates: survival, birth rates, recruitment into the herd, habitat selection. We also use these GPS collars in conjunction with the GPS collars we put on wolves and cougars, which is the other animals that I study here, to understand how elk can avoid predation risk and what makes them vulnerable to predation. Bull elk can be, for example, more vulnerable in late winter, as I mentioned before, because they've exhausted their fat reserves. In the fall, they can be more resilient to predation. They've got antlers. If they stand their ground and there's not deep snow, they can fight off wolves, particularly the prime age bull elk. And so all of that feeds into our understanding of what the risks are for elk on the landscape. So as I mentioned, in terms of what the importance of elk to Yellowstone, we can think of them in some ways as a keystone species. Now, some of the traditional definition of a keystone species would be an animal that's in relatively low abundance but has a disproportionately large effect on how an ecosystem functions. Elk aren't quite fit that proper definition or that original definition of a keystone species, but if you think of a keystone species as of an animal that plays a key role in how an ecosystem functions regardless of its abundance, elk fit that title very well. And that is because they are incredibly important to how food web dynamics are structured in the Yellowstone landscape. As I mentioned, they are one of the primary prey species for Yellowstone's top predators, the wolves and the cougars. And as part of the research that we conduct here on predation, predator-prey dynamics, we are really interested in what are the impacts of wolves on their prey, such as elk. Elk make up, for example, 90% of a wolf's diet through much of the year. For cougars, it's more like 60% of their diet these days, sometimes 55%. They're starting to use more deer in Yellowstone than they used to 20 years ago. And so they're really important to not only feeding predators and predation, which is a powerful ecological force that can shape ecosystem food webs because of that top-down pressure. It essentially causes nutrients to ripple through the ecosystem. So when a wolf pack kills an elk or a cougar kills an elk, they feed on that themselves, and then a lot of that meat, that biomass, can go to the scavenger communities, the ravens, the magpies, the golden eagles, the bald eagles, the bears, all which depend on that food resource. And when you have food webs that are more complex and more connections out there, they're more resilient to environmental changes, and so elk are very much at the core of that. Then if you look at the role that elk play as grazers, they graze grasses and forbs and sedges, and that is really important for nutrient cycling in that component of the food web. So every time they're eating grasses and stirring up the dirt and the soil and grazing those, that creates more plant productivity. It helps with soil retention, moisture retention. It can help with that nutrient cycling through the lower parts of the soil communities that are important for regenerating plant growth. And of course, when elk defecate or urinate, they're spreading more of those nutrients back onto the landscape. And then that even feeds into a whole host of bacteria and microbes that live in the soil. So elk are very much at the core of that Yellowstone's really rich and complex food web system. And that only isn't for the park, but elk rippling out through. One of the things we've learned about elk movement from studying with GPS collars is not only is Yellowstone National Park at the core of really important ranges for multiple elk herds that use this area, but so too are the lands throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Because remember, elk are migrating throughout the year to these different parts of the ecosystem. Some of that includes entirely within Yellowstone. We have, for example, cows that will spend the winter right here behind us in the northern range of Yellowstone. And right now, some of those cow elk are starting to move down to their summer range down near Yellowstone Lake. So they'll go all the way down, 50 miles down into the interior of the park or further to their summer range to track that food resource. Other cow elk are migrating north or up into the higher elevations here to the north or the east and the west of the park. So it really depends on what those young elk have learned from their mothers, and they tend to follow those same migration patterns. Again, when we come back to the predation, what we've learned here is that the decline in elk and the story of elk population growth and declines is really driven by a number of factors. So let's go back in time and think about the history of elk in this park in the past. We have to remember, for many, many thousands of years, elk were an incredibly important part of native peoples. The different tribal nations that have used Yellowstone historically were very much focused and relied on elk for a source of food through the meat, for clothing because the hides were really strong and easy to work with. Elk ivories, which are the teeth, the vestigial canine teeth of an elk, were really important for certain tribes' clothing and decorations, for a part of their cultural and spiritual connection to these places. In fact, the Yellowstone River that flows out of Yellowstone National Park has been referred to by many of the local tribes as the Elk River. That right there tells you just how key this animal was to many people in this landscape for thousands of years. When the park became established 150 years ago, it was seen as a sort of a wide open era where there was large-scale destruction through market hunting and poaching of our wildlife populations, and elk were very much subject to that. And so there was a big collapse in what was originally described as flourishing elk populations when the early explorers came here. Lewis and Clark described this landscape full of elk, and the early period of Yellowstone's history was one of destruction of many wildlife, and elk were part of that. When the Park Service got into a new era where the U.S. Cavalry took control, they protected a lot of animal species, not all, because they continued to get rid of the predators, which are an important part of the story of elk here, but they protected the elk, and to a point where they were feeding elk in the wintertime. And then we entered the era when the Park Service was created, in that era moving forward for about 50 years. Much of the principles of managing animals like elk fell in line with the philosophies of agriculture, particularly when it came to controlling ungulate numbers, such as elk and bison and pronghorn. And it was sort of at a time when we really didn't understand the ecology of natural systems and the importance of things like predators and how weather and other factors shaped ungulate dynamics like elk. And so the park managers at the time, working with what they thought was the best information available to them, managed elk very heavily. This involved periods of time when there were too few elk. And then in good winters, when there wasn't severe winters, that elk population would grow. Then it was felt there were too many elk, so there was elk culling, and that involved shooting and killing elk, not only inside the park, but a lot of elk just outside the park boundary. But it also involved a really important part of elk conservation throughout this country, and that is elk trans locations. From the period of the 1930s until the mid-1960s, approximately 15,000 elk were translocated out of Yellowstone National Park to restock elk populations or recreate new elk populations throughout the lower 48, into Canada. Even Argentina and Mexico received elk from Yellowstone. So it's a real important testament to the importance of Yellowstone and the story of elk, not only in our local area here, but elk throughout North America. Yellowstone elk are at the core of that story of elk conservation.
Yeah, I used to work down at Rocky Mountain National Park, and that was a big thing that we talk about. We had pictures of all the trains that had the elk, and they put them on a truck and
Ship
load
them
them
out.
and just let them out into the
Yeah,
park, and now
yeah.
they're everywhere down
Yeah,
there.
I mean, it was very much the model for the restoration of a large-scale ungulate. We can look to the bison today as another great example of the importance of Yellowstone in that conservation story. And then when the late 1960s came along, there was a sort of a new paradigm of how we thought about how natural systems worked. And that was really sparked by Aldo Leopold. He was contracted with a team of biologists to do what was called the Leopold Report. And that really built off predecessors of his, like George Wright in the 1930s, that really kind of tried to get managers in places like Yellowstone to think about managing ecosystems under the power of nature, not the power of humans. So starting in the late 1960s, the park changed their philosophy on how elk were managed, and that was to let nature take its course. There was no more elk trans locations. There was no more elk culling. I mean, there had been over 50,000 elk killed in Yellowstone from the early 1900s up to the late 1960s. A significant number. And then all of a sudden nature took back over. So elk were no longer subject to humans, but for the most part within the park. Of course, there was still hunting just outside the park on some of the elk, like the northern range elk herd. At this time, remember though, predators had been eradicated from about the 1930s until we restored wolves in the mid-1990s. Cougars kind of crept back in on their own in the 1980s. Elk were largely at the fate of weather events, severe winters, severe summer drought. These are all important regulatory mechanisms for elk. They can impact pregnancy rates, the ability of elk to put on enough fat to survive a winter. The 1988 fires altered a lot of habitats, and that was coupled and followed on the heels of some severe winters. And so it really was, what we were seeing is an elk population that was knocked down by the powers of weather severity. Because predators weren't there in place to kind of have that regulatory effect. And as a result, that population skyrocketed once again to what we think of as a sort of an artificially high number, and not particularly within what we would think of as or call the carrying capacity, what the resources can support. And so what we saw is pregnancy rates decline, survival decline under high densities of elk. And that's why it was recommended that to really have an important effect on the natural processes of Yellowstone's wildlife species, which is part of our mandate as a national park to preserve natural processes, to restore native species, it was decided that predators were going to be a key part of the elk story. And so wolves were reintroduced in the mid-1990s. As I mentioned, cougars came back on their own, and grizzly bears and black bears are really important predators of elk, particularly elk calves this time of the year. So all of those carnivores back in place really played a role collectively, along with human hunting just outside the park here, on that decline of what was thought of as a really superabundant elk herd back to a population level that we think is much more in tune with this landscape. So if we look at elk today in Yellowstone, and we just look at the northern range elk, which is one of the best known and best studied, again, we have what we think is a very stable, healthy population of elk. When you look at where they are in terms of target objectives, we, the National Park Service, don't set population objectives for species like elk. Again, we let nature take its course. We let them be subject to the natural forces around them, such as predation and disease and weather. But this elk herd is an incredibly important cultural elk herd and economic elk herd when they leave the park. There's they play a key role in the state of Montana's hunting economics north of the park. They provide meat for a lot of people in addition to the natural carnivore species here. And so humans are very much a part of that story. And moving forward will be continued to be. The uncertainty of Yellowstone elk, uncertainty of their future is looms large. I mean, there are emerging risks for elk, such as diseases like chronic wasting disease, which is at our doorstep, potentially here, although we haven't detected it in Yellowstone yet. And that can be a fatal disease, or that is a fatal disease to deer and elk and other ungulates that get chronic wasting disease. So we're watching that emerging threat. Brucellosis is another disease that elk carry, and of course that could be a potential transmission to livestock when elk leave the park. In fact, cases of brucellosis that have been transmitted to cattle in the Rocky Mountain West around Yellowstone have been actually transmitted from elk, not bison, even though we always hear about the story of bison, the threats of bison spreading brucellosis. So those are diseases that we as humans are interested in learning and understanding what those dynamics are. And so the future there is uncertain of what that'll mean. Huntings will still play an important role. In fact, what we learned by studying the effects of human hunters on our northern range elk herd is that they actually played a more significant role in the first decade of wolf recovery on the decline of northern elk compared to wolves themselves, because we have really good understanding of wolves predatory role and predatory effect on reducing or regulating elk numbers. We think today, over the last decade, wolves are playing a more important role, so too are cougars and bears on elk population dynamics, particularly through their impact on elk calves, because they kill a lot of elk calves collectively this time of the year. Human hunting still occurs north of the park line. Outside the park, there's no hunting inside Yellowstone, of course. But so humans are still very much part of this dynamic. So even though Yellowstone has adopted the management practice of letting nature take its course, restoring large carnivores, and that in part is to help with natural regulation of ungulate numbers, humans are still very much part of that story just outside of the park. But we have what we think is a very healthy and resilient elk herd. I think the elk, to me, is sort of the ultimate animal of the Rocky Mountain West. They are incredibly resilient to the challenges that they face in a place like Yellowstone, the harsh winters, the unpredictability of food resources from one season to the next, the risk, navigating a landscape of risk for predators, and they're really good at that. Again, they're not particularly just sitting there as wolf bait or cougar bait. They actually have evolved many strategies to be successful living and coexisting with carnivores, and that has to do with things like grouping, safety in numbers. So elk tend to group up in herds. That creates more eyes and senses for detecting lurking predators. And like I said before, animals like wolves in particular need vulnerable prey to be successful. So a prime age cow between the ages of 2 and 13 really doesn't have a whole lot to worry about. They're not really a target of wolf predation, but their young calves are, and so too are the older cow elk in that population. So they can face predation risk and navigate that landscape quite successfully. The park is trying to study and understand competition between the different ungulates, the hoofed animals. So we have long-term work collectively, our team, to study how elk are competing with bison, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, deer, and the other ungulates that they share this ecosystem with. Who gets what resources? Is there enough for everyone? Right now, our current understanding of this landscape is they all play a really important role in the grazing community and grazing health of our grasslands. And there's a lot of food for even a lot more animals, a lot more bison and elk than we see today. And so what's really important moving forward is for us to engage with a diverse body of stakeholders, people that want to come here and experience Yellowstone for its abundant and diverse wildlife, to be able to see elk and wolves interacting with one another, whether it's to photograph them, to nurture our souls and our spirit, because it might be an important part of our culture. It supports a huge economic viability of our surrounding communities, not only the park, but in our surrounding gateway communities for people that want to have healthy, robust populations of species like elk. And so they're incredibly important to Yellowstone's past. We've learned a lot about managing wildlife and maybe more importantly, how to not intervene and manage them and let nature's processes take control. And again, that's our mandate as a park service. Now that carnivores have been restored to Yellowstone, we have one of the most unique opportunities to understand how a species like the elk faces the challenges that I've just discussed, yet still thrive, which they very much are doing. We have very healthy, robust elk herds in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And once more, moving beyond our borders of the park, recognizing that elk rely not only on Yellowstone National Park for their safety and security and success long term, but as well as the public and private lands that surround the park, because they move through this gradient of protection to more human-dominated landscapes. And somewhere in between those gradients is where we are trying to understand that path of the elk and what their long-term success will be. And we have high hopes for that. And again, recognizing that at its core, Yellowstone is going to be that really important preserve for elk in this system.
That ton of great information.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, I got a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned, all about the life history and the management and everything, but then you talked about the people who want to come and see elk.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier in the talk, you mentioned a little bit about now we're dropping calves. So
Yes.
as someone who gets to work here in the park and knows where elk hide and things, like if you were to come, what are some tips that you want to give somebody if they're coming to see elk? Where might they go this time of year? What might they be aware of? Elk, we think of like, bears and wolves
Yes.
as staying safe distances, but if you could share a little bit about what elk, how to view them safely around here.
Sure. So, I've worked now in Yellowstone for over 25 years now, primarily with the predators, wolves and cougars. I've been involved with some bear work, but the elk actually is the animal I think I'm most, particularly this time of the year, cognizant of as a risk out there. So what's really important for the public to be aware of is that, like all wildlife, you want to respect the elk when you see one. The maintaining a proper distance to elk in Yellowstone, that would be 25 yards, avoiding, but remembering at certain times of the year you would probably want to be even more careful of getting being further away than 25 yards from an elk. So right now cow elk are incredibly vigilant and protective over their newborn elk calves, and they will charge, they will stomp, they will run at you to protect their calves and to try to discourage you from being around the area. So it's really important for the public to be able to come to a place like Yellowstone and enjoy the beauty of an elk, watch those young elk calves frolic as they get a little bit older, but being very aware of the defensive nature of a mother elk. It's not something you want to mess with. It's the scariest animal in the landscape right now. I'd much rather contend with a bear encounter or other animal encounter out there than a lone cow elk on a trail right now. So remembering that. Equally important is during the fall breeding season, the rut, what we call the rut. Mammoth Hot Springs is one of the best places in the country to come and watch elk breeding behavior, and those bull elk will come into the Mammoth area to try to gather up their harems, or even outside of the developed area like Mammoth. They're bugling, they're roaring, they're changing and charging at each other, and fighting over controlling those breeding rights. And a bull elk can be also a very risky animal. They're supercharged with hormones, and they will not discriminate between running down a person or charging a vehicle if it's too close to their cows that they're protecting. So those are two key times of the year: the month of May, late May, early June, or the month of June in particular, as well as the fall, late September, early October breeding season. The public should come and enjoy and embrace the beauty of Yellowstone elk, but be very respectful of their space and of those behaviors those times of the year. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, we'll see if, maybe I'll catch you off guard, but do you have a story about an elk, or just like an anecdote or something about why they're such a cool species and why they're so important to Yellowstone, like
Yes.
you personally?
Yes. So, when you study individuals through collaring, you kind of pick up on their patterns. I look at their movements a lot from day to day, and where's this elk and what's this elk doing, and you follow them through their lives, and you become really interested in their stories. And one story in particular is really fascinating to me. Elk 1125, we give them unique numbers, and that's part of how we keep track of the data, but elk 1125 was a cow elk that we collared in 2011. And she was born, we age her, we can pull a tooth from the elk, and we can accurately age an animal. We do this with every wolf kill or cougar killed elk. We can pull a tooth from the dead animal. We can submit that to a lab that you can accurately age that animal by counting the rings and the teeth through. And so we do that with live captured elk as well. And so elk 1125 was born in the summer of 1994. This was the year before wolves were reintroduced. This was the year when cougar populations were starting to increase, when grizzly and black bear numbers were high and abundant. And this cow elk lived through 25 and a half years of one of the most abundant and concentrated area of carnivores anywhere in the country. And this cow elk was eventually killed by wolves at the ripe age of 25 and a half years old. But here's a cow elk that successfully navigated the challenges of Yellowstone's landscape, navigated all those years of living amongst carnivores, and was successful, was resilient. She probably produced calves every year for the bulk of her life until she reached her mid-teens. And yet she then went on to live another 10 years, despite all those carnivores out there. So that just her story, elk 1125, who basically was born before wolves came back and died long after they had been established, really represents their resilience, their ability to adapt to a changing environment, and really represents the spirit and the soul of Yellowstone's wildlife. So 1125 was a really amazing animal to me. So,
Well, that is awesome. Yeah. I'm going to jump back over on camera here with you. So I want to take these off first. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this video. I want to thank Dan for sharing the stories and all of his information.
Thanks, Jake.
Hopefully you guys had a notebook and a pen and pad. He's got it's a fire hose of information that come out of there. So it's always fun talking to Dan.
Yeah.
But thank you again for following along our virtual video series, our 150th anniversary series that we're doing here. We thank you for your support of Yellowstone National Park, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Yep. Yeah, thanks, Jake.